Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Loggins. Thank you so much for being here for Home Folks Dickson County. While you're here at the YouTube channel, Home Folks DC, please subscribe. It's absolutely free of charge to do so. And next time you're surfing on Facebook, follow the Home Folks Dickson County Facebook page. Appreciate that very, very much. I had the privilege of being on the air in Dickson County for a decade plus, from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. During that time, made a lot of friends, made a lot of memories, and that's the purpose of this podcast series, to relive some of those memories, retell some of those stories. Now, our guest today I never had a chance to work with, but I become friends with Mr. Dale Turner in recent years. I was introduced to Dale several years back by the late Chuck Dolphin and Donnie Craig. We've been good friends ever since. What an industry giant, not only in the radio business, but in record promotions as well. And we here in Dickson County for a few years were so very fortunate to have him on the air here as he eased into retirement. We have a lot of ground to cover on a lot of fronts on this edition of Home Folks Dickson County. Dale, how are you?
Hey, Ken, I'm good.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm looking forward to it.
Same here.
I appreciate it. How's everything going?
Well, I'm old and retired. I miss radio, but doing well. I decided to get off the air and travel with my wife and just enjoy my grandkids. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk backstory as we kick things off on this edition of Home Folks Dickson County. Let's go back to the very beginning. When and where you were born, Dale?
1951, July 11, in St. Louis, Missouri, at Barnes Hospital. I am the middle child of 3 kids, all brothers. So, yeah, St. Louis back in 51.
A bit about your parents. Tell me their names and what they were doing at the time as far as occupations around the time you came along.
My mother's name, Atrell Beatrice Turner.
I love that.
Yeah.
Atrell.
Or I guess some people call it Beatrice, but I heard my mom always pronounce her name as Atrell Beatrice.
Beatrice, okay.
Yeah. And she was born in Louisiana, but right after she was born, the family moved to Kennett, Missouri, the Boot Hill.
Yes.
Yeah. My dad was born Jimmy Johnson Turner, and he was born in Pontotoc, Mississippi, right outside of Tupelo.
Okay.
And then, after a few years, his family also moved to Kennett, Missouri. Both of my parents' families were sharecroppers.
Okay. So that's how they first crossed paths, as far as you know, in Kennett, Missouri. Okay.
Exactly. They were farming, sharecropping, and I guess they might have met as neighbors or in school. I'm not sure. But and then, of course, they got married, and my older brother was born there in Kennett. But then they moved us up to St. Louis, because, after World War II, a lot of people started migrating to the larger cities in order to find factory work. They moved to St. Louis, and then a few years later, I was born.
Tell me a bit about your siblings. Tell me about your 2 brothers, their names.
Yeah, Jimmy Roy Turner, my older brother. We were all 4 years apart. Interesting story about my brother Jim's middle name. His middle name is Roy. My middle name is Dale. So if you can imagine, my parents named us, our middle names anyway, after Roy Rogers and Dale Evans.
So what happens with the 3rd brother?
Yeah. I guess they didn't name him Trigger or...
I hope not.
No, he's Larry Dwayne Turner.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And he's 4 years younger than I am. Yeah, I loved my brothers. Jim has passed. Larry lives in D.C. We all had interesting, different paths. My brother Jim, right out of high school, went into the Army and served about a decade in the U.S. Army. My brother Larry also, after school, joined the Army. Didn't spend quite as long in the service, but I was the only guy that did not follow that path. Went to college and then dropped out of college.
And away we went.
And away we went into radio.
There you go. And once you're in, you're in. Any memories or recollections of grandparents? Did they live nearby, or were they still in Were they in Kennett, or what was the situation with you growing up?
Both sets of grandparents also came up to St. Louis.
Okay. Families, they would stick together back then. You know,
That's
if
true.
one moved, the rest of them would move. Yeah.
Yeah. But the only recollections I have are of my dad's parents, and we called them Grandpa and Big Mama. Okay. And it's interesting because Big Mama was only 4'11".
Okay, so it was kind of a little bit of irony there going on.
True.
Mm-hmm.
But my Grandpa Turner, the best memory I have is my parents would have me stay over sometimes at their house in St. Louis. And Grandpa Turner I loved him because he would wake up early on Saturday mornings and go down to the neighborhood bakery and buy us some donuts. And I'd have chocolate donuts and milk, and he'd set me in front of the TV, and I got to watch cartoons all morning.
So you love Grandpa big time.
Yeah, he spoiled me big time.
Well, talk about growing up a little bit in St. Louis. As far as how far back do your recollections take you? Things you like to do, even before school years rolled around. Do you have any recollections of what you were into? Who would you play with? What would you play? Just anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, we lived right off of Broadway in the city of St. Louis.
So you're in the heart of town.
We lived about 2 or maybe 3 blocks from the Mississippi River, okay, in a little old 2-story house. And my mom was always very strict, and she'd say, do not walk down towards the river because that's where Shantytown is. And I didn't really know what that meant, but what she was saying was not a good place for me to explore, right? But where we lived was interesting because it was right down the street from the Anheuser-Busch Brewery. You could smell the
process, the brewing process.
You had that aroma, and then a couple of blocks over was the St. Louis, or maybe it was called the American Shoe Factory. And then, of course, you could smell this, all the shoe leather or shoe soles being thrown together. It's
amazing how we can associate smells with childhood.
Yes.
And things like that.
Yeah, and since Broadway was a main thoroughfare into downtown St. Louis, there were a lot of city buses. So I always remember the smell of the fumes of diesel, as these buses crisscrossed across town on Broadway.
Now, you couldn't have been that far from Sportsman's Park or the home of the Cardinals, correct?
Well, yes. My brother and I spent a couple of days in the summertime going to the old Cardinal Sportsman's Park.
Okay.
Yeah. It was a long bus ride, though.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And then, speaking of friends, I can only remember elementary school friends. I had a friend named Scott Lowry, and we were just best buds, and we would play after school. And then I had my first girlfriend. I think it was in 6th or 7th grade. Her name was Mary Smith.
Okay.
And she lived just a few doors down. And that's where I got my first kiss.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Mary Smith.
From Mary. All right.
But then our house burned down when I was in the 8th grade.
Okay.
We had a house fire. It was, I think, caused by lightning from a storm. We could not live in the house after that. And my dad, for the first time, went out to St. Louis County, bought us a small house, and we became suburbanites. I had to leave Mary Smith and all my friends and start brand new in junior high out in Lee May, Missouri.
Okay. Now, before you made that move in those early years, did you always have a TV in the house, or was just a radio for a while in the house? Do you recall?
We had both, although I think our TV was black and white. I remember coming home from school, and my 2 favorite TV shows were Superman and, my favorite cartoon show was Popeye. Eat your spinach.
Sure.
Be big and strong. So, and I also remember before our house burned, I had a bicycle, and my mom and dad were very trusting, and I guess they were trying to instill some responsibility in me, but they would let me go on my bicycle for blocks and blocks away from the home. And one of my favorite things to do on my bicycle was on Saturdays, take my allowance and ride down to on Cherokee Street where there was a record store. I'd spend all of my allowance and a lot of my Saturday at the Cherokee record store.
I was wondering where this seed was planted for a fascination with radio and music in general. Did you have any particular stations or personalities that you remember listening to in those early years in St. Louis?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I can tell you that I listened to the radio probably as much as I watched TV. Mm-hmm. My favorite radio station, KXOK, 630 on your dial. That was the big top 40 station. I would call every chance I got. If it was they'd have a make it or break it feature, or they'd have a 10th caller wins, or maybe it was dedication night, and I was always on the phone because I was always listening to the radio. And my favorite DJ was Johnny Rabbit. He was the nighttime personality, and
this is Rabbit,
as in the animal, the pet, and he had an alter ego voice. So that was the rabbit, and he was just Johnny. But really, it was Johnny Rabbit. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I was fascinated always by radio. I can remember asking my mom, sitting in the kitchen, how does all that stuff come out of this speaker, And then I would always go over to my Uncle Bill's house a lot of times on the weekends. And, he was the type of guy that puts you on his knees. And he would say, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? Mm-hmm. And, of course, most kids would say, I want to be an astronaut or a baseball player or, whatever. And I always told him I wanted to be a DJ. I want to be a radio DJ. So even at an early age, like 7, 8, 9 years old, that was on my mind, and that was a destiny I wanted to achieve. I would always buy records that I thought my mom would like. I don't know. I just thought, this would be a way to please her. And so I would go to the Cherokee record shop and buy like North to Alaska by Johnny Horton. or they were called crossovers. It might be a country hit, but it also might be a pop hit. So I knew my mom liked those kinds of songs.
So you were early on, you're programming to your household.
Right.
And you didn't even know it.
It's true.
You're pleasing an audience.
That's right. I was, trying to create a playlist that everybody in the family would enjoy. When I got to be a teenager, I started playing bass guitar.
That's right.
So down in my bedroom in the basement, I rigged up a microphone, and I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I would plug in my microphone to my amplifier for my guitar, and I would record me doing the weather or, commercials, and play records. And so that was my own makeshift studio. I was preparing an audition tape, and I didn't even know it.
Exactly. Hey, we're visiting with Dale Turner on this very special edition of Home Folks Dickson County. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, also right here on the YouTube channel. Please subscribe. It's absolutely free of charge to do so. Home Folks Dickson County. And by the way, Dale's autobiography, Turner's Big Radio and Record Adventure, is available at Amazon.com. Amazon.com, check that out. And we have some breaking news about that book that we're going to talk about in just a while. We're awfully excited about that, and I can't wait to share that with you. Talking with music industry legend Dale Turner, both in radio and the record business, and we're in his elementary school years, high school years. Did you like school?
I did. I found, especially high school, great. I mean, it developed such memories, lifelong memories. When I got to high school, I decided I wanted to be in sports. But unfortunately for me, I wasn't good enough to make the varsity teams in basketball or wrestling, although I did do cross country one year. Mm-hmm. But then I decided, maybe... Because there's 3 groups back in my high school days. They were the preps and the hoods and the music people. So I said, well, if I'm not good in sports, I'm going to, work my way into the music. So I took band for all 4 years of high school, played the bass, the string bass, the bass fiddle. Also, I was in the chorus for all 4 years of my high school. So, yeah, that was my passion, and that was my focus in high school. And from learning the string bass, and my teacher, by the way, Mr. Hem, was just a delight and a great mentor. Taught me a lot. Through my string bass playing, my dad bought me a bass guitar. It was one of those primitive Sears Silvertone, I think was the brand.
Okay.
So I had the a bass guitar and an amplifier. And then my cousin, Jack Turner, when he found out I played bass guitar, he wanted me to be in his little rock and roll band. I guess you call it a garage band, but it really developed into something a little more than that. I played bass guitar for Jack's band called the Shades of Dawn.
Shades of Dawn.
Yeah. And we would play.
And this would have been mid-'60s.
You're right. We would try, Ken, to play all the British Invasion songs, cover all those, maybe a couple of Beatles. But we really kind of moved it into soul music. In fact, at one point we had a lady who knew all the Motown music, the Gladys Knight and the Supremes, and she used to front our band. But we'd play on on weekends at the movie theaters. There would always be two movies shown, and we would be the intermission entertainment, and we'd get right on stage in front of the screen and play for 30 minutes. So we did a lot of those around the St. Louis area. And we would play teen towns at different high schools, and we did a lot of pool parties in the summertime. So that was a great outlet for me, and not much of a musician, but I think it was just a carryover to my fascination of radio. I left Jack's band for a while. I got with a group called the Soul Binders. This is where we started, going across the Mississippi River into Illinois and playing
regional,
playing some older adult nightclubs. So that was fun. And then my final group before I graduated was called TCB, more of a blues and jazz ensemble. So yeah, great memories from playing in those local bands in St. Louis.
Graduation time rolls around. Did you have a game plan? Here's what I'm going to do. Here's where I'm going to do it.
Well, it was kind of forced on me. When I graduated high school, I had signed up for my first year at Merrimack Community College. At that point, my father and my mom decided they wanted to move back down south because that's where they grew up. My dad got a job in Memphis at the International Steel Company because he was a welder. That's what he did in St. Louis. And he found that he could get another job similar in Memphis. And so he and my mom and my little brother, Larry, they all moved to Memphis. I decided to stay behind in St. Louis, and I lived in the basement of my aunt and uncle's house.
Okay.
They lived in the same neighborhood. So here I am, 18, maybe going on 19, and I just independently strike out on my own.
You're on your own.
I'm living in the basement of my Aunt Jenny and Uncle Buster, and they were so gracious to let me, come and go. And I went to school my first semester, and it didn't have a communications major, so I'm thinking this is like high school all over again. In the second semester, I found a speech and drama professor, and they wanted us to write a story on something that had to do with either drama, stage acting, or communications, TV, radio. That's when I decided I was going to do an interview with the program director of KXOK. So I called the station, lined up a time I could come in and interview Mort Crowley. He was the morning DJ and the program director. So I show up at KXOK, green as can be. I don't even know what I was going to ask him. And a lady comes out, and it was Mort's assistant, and she says, Mort's not going to be able to make himself available for the interview, but we do have an opening for a nighttime producer. Would you be interested?
Wow.
Right place at the right time, huh? So I accepted the job, minimum wage, working 7 to midnight. And really, a producer at a big station like that is nothing more than a gopher. He's the guy who gets the DJ a cup of coffee or answers the phones when there's a contest or, request.
But it's that foot in the door.
Yeah. I'm working in the biggest station in St. Louis, and it was really, talk about broadcasting 101. And the engineer took me under his wings and, taught me about how the station operates. And he eventually helped me put together an audition tape.
Okay.
And that is when I decided, enough of college. I'm going to go find my first on-air radio job. But I couldn't find one in St. Louis because you had to have experience.
Oh, sure. Major market.
Yeah, it was a top 10 market back then. So I had to leave St. Louis in order to finally find a place that would accept me and give me experience. So I loaded up my car. I think I had $75 in my pocket and about 20 audition tapes. And I struck out and I visited little towns in Missouri and Illinois. And I just kept going south and south. And every time I saw a tower of a radio station, I'd stop and apply. I didn't get a call back anywhere. It had only been a week or two, but so I'm all the way down into Arkansas, and I decided, I'm just going to go ahead and drive to Memphis, spend a couple of nights with my mom and dad. So I get to Memphis, and my mom just, off the cuff says, I saw a little radio station down by the Navy base in Millington, which was about, 10, 15 miles south of Memphis. And so, the next day I drove down there and walked in and offered my audition tape. And the guy says, when can you start? I'm like, well, immediately. It was a little daytimer. That's a radio station that signs on at sunrise and signs off at sunset. They only had 2 employees. They had, the morning guy signed on the radio station and worked till 12 noon. And then the other guy came in and did from 12 noon to sign off.
Okay.
So they had 2 on-air talents and then the general manager who also sold advertising. That was the whole radio station. So I accepted the job, and the guy said, well, I want you to use your middle name, Dale, because we're a country station, and that sounds more country than Dennis. Because I had these dreams and I had these visions of being Skinny Denny on your favorite rock and roll station, right? But I was so happy just to get a job, my first break on air, that, I took my middle name and I've used it ever since. And then I went to Elkins Institute, which is like a 8-week program that helps you get your first-class radio license. Back then, this, Ken, you had to have a first-class license to work at certain radio stations that had directional antennas.
That's right. So
that you could read all the appropriate meters. So I got that Elkins Institute first-class license. That got me a job at KWAM in Memphis, which actually was in West Memphis, Arkansas. It was licensed to West Memphis, but it was a Memphis station, and they wanted me to do mornings. So again, 6 to noon on KWFM. And then that first-class license got me a job in Sikeston. A lot of people go, why did you leave Memphis to go to Sikeston, Missouri? But actually the station in Sikeston paid more money. And then, lo and behold, I'm in Sikeston, Missouri, like 8 months, and I get a call from Dan Daly, who took Johnny Rabbit's place on KXOK. I was his intern, right? I was his producer. And he calls me, he goes, hey, Dale, I'm starting a new radio staff down here in San Antonio, Texas. You should come down and do the morning show. And I'm like, Dan, I haven't even been on the air more than a couple of years. I said, I'm totally intimidated that you would ask me to join you after you've worked in, all these Miami and Charlotte and St. Louis, and you're asking me to come to San Antonio. He goes, I'll help you. I'll work you through it. My wife at the time was Sherry, my high school sweetheart. I don't think she was crazy about moving to Texas, but I just saw it as an incredible opportunity. And we did fall in love with San Antonio. But I went down and worked a couple of years with Dan Daly at KITY, Kitty Country. It was the first time I ever saw an ocean because we would drive down from San Antonio to Corpus Christi, and see the Gulf of Mexico. And I was like, wow. For a kid in St. Louis that had been landlocked for 19 years, that was a big deal.
You were never afraid of a new challenge during your entire radio career.
Yeah, I know a lot of guys weren't like that. They wanted to stay in their hometown. Yeah, and I would have loved to have, stayed and worked in St. Louis, but I knew I had to become a better air talent and, get more experience. And so if I found another job that paid a couple of $100 more, I would go and not be worried about the geography of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Visiting with Dale Turner on this edition of Home Folks, Dickson County. Thank you so much for being here. While you're here at the YouTube channel, I want to remind you, please subscribe. It's absolutely free of charge to do so. And the next time you're on Facebook, follow us there as well. We keep you up to date there about upcoming podcasts that we do here on Home Folks, Dickson County. Now, you touched on this a while ago. You're getting these gigs, doing morning shows. You eventually land in San Antonio. We're talking the early 70s here, I would think.
72, 73.
So you have to be getting noticed, and that means some probably pretty wild stunts, promotions, things like that. Kind of go hand in hand with a morning show. Some of the more outrageous that we can talk about that you can think of being pulled off that got you in the show noticed.
This was later on in Cincinnati.
Okay.
I think the weirdest thing I ever did was I was interviewing a group of women called the Chicago Knockers. They were mud wrestlers, okay? And they traveled around to different cities and performed in nightclubs. So we had them on my radio show because they were promoting that, and we were advertising that they were going to be in town. And this little lady called the Blonde Bombshell. Yeah, that was her name. And she challenged me to a bout of mud wrestling.
Oh, boy.
And like an idiot, I agreed. So, that weekend, we went to the nightclub. I had my little gym shorts on and my radio station T-shirt. And, I'm in a ring of mud with this beautiful blonde. She couldn't have weighed more than 95 pounds. I mean, there were a couple of hundred people in the audience, and this little woman kicked my butt. I mean, she had me in a full Nelson within 30 seconds, rubbing my face in the mud.
You didn't let this happen. It wasn't fixed. You were I actually
was
giving some effort here.
A party to it because I thought it would be great exposure for my radio station.
Sure.
And boy,
I had a packed house, I imagine.
It was so embarrassing and humiliating. And we went through that. Thankfully, the referee called the match, and
You were doing Andy Kaufman things before he did.
Yeah, but I think that was the strangest promotion I ever got involved in. But, speaking of wrestling, when I worked in Memphis, to supplement my income at that radio station in Memphis, I, on weekends, would go to Eddie Bond's Radio Ranch. Now, this was a local country singer who was also an entrepreneur, and he had his own nightclub, and he would pay me $25 to, MC whatever band was playing, and, my wife and I would make an extra couple of bucks, and we'd get a free steak dinner. And then during the week, he would take some of the pro wrestlers, because Memphis was kind of a hotbed for wrestling. And we would go to little towns around West Tennessee, and I would be the ring announcer, and my wife would sell concessions. That's how we made extra money to, help our income as a radio DJ.
Now, was this before Jerry Lawler came along, or around the same time?
It might have been right before.
Right before he just made that territory such a iconic territory. Yeah.
And I remember being in the dressing room before the wrestling matches, and I would listen to these guys plan out
work everything out.
Their takedowns.
Yeah.
It would be like Tojo Yamamoto against
Jackie
Fargo. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting time.
Wow. Now, on these morning shows that you were doing at these various stations, would you prefer to work solo, or did you always have a sidekick or maybe two sidekicks?
In San Antonio, I did it by myself, and then I got my first program director job up in Indiana, and that was a solo morning show. But I always had sidekicks. the weather guy would come in and
news guy or whatever,
so or the farm director who did the farm reports. So there was a lot of interaction and banter going on there. And then when I got to Nashville, WKDA in Nashville in the 70s, I got teamed up with Debbie Jones, and we had a show called the Dale and DJ Wake Up Show.
At this point, you're starting to make, and you probably made some connections in previous years, artist connections that would serve you later in the record promotions business.
Yeah, Ken, I got to tell you, when I came to Nashville to work at KDA, that was the ultimate education about the music business. All those other radio stations before I came to Nashville, none of them reported their playlist to the Billboard magazine or the national, charts. So I didn't realize there was even such a position as a record promoter. But when I got to Nashville, WKDA along with WSM were both playlist contributors to the national charts. And all of a sudden, these guys from Music Row would come to the radio station with their newest record or their newest artist. And I'm like, wow, there are people that do this. And that's how you begin the process of understanding how the record business works in conjunction with radio. Mm-hmm. So, that was the time in the mid to late 70s that I was a program director, choosing the music and also being on the air. But I really preferred being a program director. I liked having us being in charge of a staff and trying to motivate them into, doing the best job they can to be the most entertaining. And so the music it was important, especially to Music Row. But if I'm trying to compete against another dozen stations in town, I got to have a great DJ staff.
Sure. Any artist connections that stand out in your mind during that time in the mid-70s that maybe artists that you interviewed or maybe you were intro to concert for or whatever as a working still in radio?
I would just bring up a couple of names during that time in Nashville because our radio station was right down the street from the Printer's Alley. Mm-hmm. George Jones had a nightclub called the Possum Holler.
Yeah.
And I used to MC some shows at the Possum Holler. So I would go down there on some given nights and drink a beer with John Anderson. I mean, he hadn't even recorded, his first record yet on Warner Brothers. Now, he was just in town trying to, make a start. He was laying roofs for a living until he got his first contract with Warner Brothers. And I became good friends with him. And then I remember a time when Larry Gatlin would call the radio station when I was on the air and say, hey Dale, thanks for playing my record, but that record sounds a little scratchy. Why don't I get Columbia Records to send you a fresh copy? And that would never happen in any other town.
Yeah, that's wild.
So Larry Gatlin, I remember one time Ronnie Millsap had already had a few hits, and our studios were in the Stallman building, and we had a bomb threat. Everybody had to evacuate the Stallman building for about 30 minutes. If no one's going to be in the studio, what I did was I put a Ronnie Millsap Live at the Opry on the turntable and just let it track. Well, when I got back into the studio, the needle had stuck on the vinyl of that album. And so a few days later, I got a letter from Ronnie Millsap. And it was like, obviously done by his assistant, but it said, "Hey, Dale, thanks for playing my album
on repeat
live at the Opry, and RCA is going to send you up a fresh copy." That was good. And then we did a promotion, I think, with Conway Twitty. We gave away a diamond ring from a local jeweler, and I remember having to go up to Hendersonville and present the winner with the ring. And Conway was so gracious.
Oh, yeah.
And I just, I don't know why I remember that moment. And then we did a Johnny Paycheck Take This Job and Shove It contest where people got a day off work paid for by the record company, and they got to meet Johnny Paycheck. So those are the things that were stuck in my brain about working at WKDA, where the artists not only live in the town with you, but they listen to you. I felt like we can't be just a normal country station. I mean, I thought about growing up listening to Ralph Emery and how he, got to sit in the studio with Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson. And I thought, well, we got to have that same approach.
An amazing time. Nashville was so different then, wasn't it?
It was. It was smaller. And, DJs weren't that big of a deal. I mean, maybe Ralph Emery, but for the most part, I think it's because people could run into Tammy Wynette at the local Kroger store, or, Crystal Gale at the Green Hills Mall. And so being a DJ, and we were just the messenger to the stars. But when I got to Cincinnati, being a DJ up there was a much bigger deal. You were a real celebrity.
Visiting with Dale Turner on this edition of Home Folks, Dickson County. We're talking about his stint at WKDA Nashville in the late 70s. I want you to tell me about Les Acree and his impact on your career. By this time, you're a pretty seasoned DJ, pretty seasoned professional. You've been in the business for a decade roughly, but we always have our mentors still at that stage. Tell me about Les.
Well, Les was my second biggest influencer of my career. My first was Dan Daly out of St. Louis. I mean, for him to give me a break to go to Texas and be on a major market station. But when I was in Terre Haute, Indiana, I was trying to send out resumes and tapes and get to that next size market. And Les called me and wanted me to come to WKDA. And he was the program director, and then he left to go back to Memphis, and I became, I replaced him as the PD. He taught me so much about radio and how to conduct yourself on the air. And he was a big believer in getting out into the community, having a station softball team and, associating with up-and-coming stars because, hey, who knows when the next Garth Brooks is going to walk in and ask for airplay. So, yeah, Les was great. And then years later, when I was in Cincinnati, Les hired me to come back to Memphis, and I worked at one of the biggest stations there, WMC. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate his belief and faith in me. He liked my on-air work, and there were a lot of air checks I sent out that never got embraced, but Les did, and I'm so thankful for it.
Incredible story. I want to talk about you making that jump to Cincinnati because you're in Nashville, you're PD, epicenter of country music. Tell me about this opportunity that comes along out of Cincinnati and what made you jump at that?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it had to do with my personal life. I had gone through a divorce. My high school sweetheart divorced me after 7 years and continued working at WKDA, and I put even more of my life and passion into my career than ever before. And then one day in 1979, I drove over to Knoxville because Mr. Jim Dick Broadcasting, they owned WKDA and WKDF, which was the big rock station, and they also owned WIVK, the big country station in Knoxville. And so as the program director, I wanted to have a lunch with Mr. Dick, and I went over to Knoxville, and I sat with him, and I asked for a raise. And he said, "Sir, you're doing a great job for us at KDA, but in terms of earnings, you have reached the ceiling." So I came back to Nashville, and I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to move on. And it just so happened that I was friends with a guy named Gene Hughes. Now, Gene Hughes, his hometown was Cincinnati. I had gone up to Cincinnati with him to see a Bengals game. He was an independent record promoter, but he also had a big hit in the 60s. He was part of the Casinos, and the song, he was the lead singer for the song, "Then You Can Tell Me Goodbye." Sure. That was a big hit. I think it was national. So anyway, I was buddies with Gene, and he had connections in his old hometown of Cincinnati. So lo and behold, I get a call from Jonathan Frick, another mentor of mine, and he wanted me to come up and do the afternoons at WSAI, which had been a top 40 station. They just switched to country music. And Jonathan thought, hey, with your Nashville background, you can add credibility to my new air staff. I thought, it's time for me to move on. I'm single, can't make any more money at WKDA. I mean, most guys might have tried to work, go find a job at WMAK or WLAC or, WSIX. But the draw to go to Cincinnati was too much. I had to take it.
Well, like you said earlier, you were not afraid of a new challenge, even if it took you a little ways away geographically. Cincinnati's still in your Midwestern wheelhouse as far as, comfort zone.
It was like St. Louis, really. It's kind of same size market.
Not like you're moving to the West Coast or New York City or something like that. But
right.
You would meet the love of your life, Patty, there in Cincinnati. Tell us about that.
I was the program director after Jonathan left. Okay, so I'm programming WSAI. I guess I created a persona there as the single eligible bachelor. Okay, I was doing a lot of nightclub appearances and other remotes and such. One day, our production guy, Peter, came into my office and said, hey, I met this gal at some reception the other night, and I just told her that she should get together with you. And because we need to get you out of those nightclubs, Dale. You're going crazy. You're going wild with your lifestyle. You need to settle down.
Time to grow up.
Yes. And so I met my dear wife, Patricia Tripp, on a blind date. All I had was her phone number. And one weekend I had a couple of tickets to the Reds games. I think the Reds are playing the Dodgers. And I called Pat and asked her out. And we went to a Reds-Dodgers game. That was a blind date, first date. And it was funny because afterwards, some record guy had asked me to go to the Drawbridge Inn and listen to this new singer they were thinking about signing to a contract. So, yeah, okay. So after the Reds game, I take Pat over to the club, and we listen to this guy. I meet the guy. And on the way back across the Ohio River, I pointed to the radio tower where I worked, and I said, hey, Patty, why don't we go up to the station and I'll show you around the studios? And she was like, no, not interested. That's okay.
I don't do that on a first date.
Right.
I don't visit studios.
Yeah, so I was so impressed that she wasn't impressed, and that grew into, kind of a courtship. And about a year and a half later, we were married. Yeah, Patty and I had been married for 42 years. And I told her, I said, you don't want to marry a DJ because, all we do is bounce around to different cities, and that's not really a life for everyone. And she was so much in love. She says, no, I'm ready. I've lived in Cincinnati my entire life. I'm ready.
It's about that time, after that stint in Cincinnati, that Dale Turner starts thinking about, something a little bit less nomadic, I guess I should say, than the radio business. And of course, you had some insight into the record promotions business during your time in radio. How does that door open, though, big time? And when do you make that jump?
Before I left WKDA to go to Cincinnati, I asked Joe Galante to have lunch with me. Mm-hmm. Joe was the head of the RCA division in Nashville. And so I had lunch with him, and I just said, hey, Joe, it's been fun. I'm moving to Cincinnati, continue my career in radio. I said, but man, I have learned a lot about record promotion just by observing all the different reps from the different record companies. I said, I would like to do that someday. So just keep me in the back of your mind. 4 years later, I'm in Little Rock, Arkansas, at KSSN, and I get a call from Joe Galante, and he said, hey, I have an opening in Chicago for the Midwest regional rep, so come to Nashville and talk to me about it. So, I left Kissin in Little Rock. My son was only 6 months old, and took the job in Chicago and moved the family up.
That was probably, even for a St. Louis native, that had to be a little bit of a culture shock.
It was, not to mention the weather. I could not get used to the weather in Chicago, but what a great experience and opportunity for me. That's when my life began to stabilize. No more bouncing around in radio because either bad ratings or change in management or ownership. All those things are factors in why you have to move around. Yeah, Chicago I spent 7 years up there, and I traveled my butt off. I mean, I was in and out of O'Hare Airport every week because your territory is like 10 states, and you got to go into Minneapolis and Des Moines and Detroit and get your airplay. And back then, in the 80s, RCA had probably 20 artists on their roster. They were all hitting. Bingo. Alabama was our biggest moneymaker, the group Alabama. But we had Ronnie Millsap, Keith Whitley, the Judds. We still had Waylon Jennings. I think Dolly left in the mid-'80s. But yeah, I never covered so many concerts in my life. I mean, every state fair, every arena. It was a very busy time, but evidently I was doing a good job. I was getting the airplay and getting the playlist ads that RCA needed and wanted. It really laid the groundwork for me returning to Nashville to be the head of promotion. There was a syndication company called After Midnight. This was an all-night show that was played on like 80, 90 radio stations across America. So if you got your song spun on that show, it meant all these additional spins. Well, we were in a number one battle one week with George Strait and Clint Black. RCA had Clint Black. I can't remember what song it was, but we were in a number one battle, and George Strait was also in the top 5. And so we proposed to the After Midnight show that we were going to give you a pickup truck. We would buy you a pickup truck, and it might have been that Clint Black record about the taillights. Nothing but the taillights.
There you go.
Yeah. Come to think of it. And so, we gave the show a pickup truck in exchange for an extra couple of spins on the Clint Black song. And that's what took us over the top to beat out George Strait. Now, George Strait did go number one the following week. So that's the craziest thing we've done on a national basis. I mean, we gave away trips to Vegas and, Super Bowl tickets. And one time I bought a program director a couch for his office so that he would give us the edge on a given week with playlist ads and rotations. So there you have it. It's all out in the open now.
What a time to be involved in the music business in general in Nashville when the traditional renaissance is going on and the format is just through the roof, growing and growing. Was there a conscious effort there at RCA? We need to find a hat act.
Yeah, I mean, we would have regular meetings with our A&R department, artists and repertoire, who were responsible for scouting the talent and signing the talent and recording the talent. But we would always go through our roster, and then we'd go through the competitors' roster and decide, is there an opening? I mean, we had Alabama, we had the group category tied up, but like females. At one point, we had Martina McBride. MCA had Reba McEntire, and Mercury had Shania Twain. So you try and strategize.
Sure.
How are you going to find that female that sells the most albums?
Exactly.
So we went through that, and then, the Hat Act thing I think came because Randy Travis had a lot of success in the late 80s. But he wasn't a hat act, but he was bringing the format back to neo-traditional. And so that's when, RCA decided we needed a Clint Black. Because the same year that we signed Clint, Arista signed Alan Jackson and Capitol signed Garth Brooks. And that was an explosive era.
Tremendous. Yeah. The renaissance that the format had during that time. By the late 90s, early 2000s, you find yourself transitioning to Lyric Street Records. They were owned by Disney.
Well, Ken, I always tell people that I had the good fortune of working at two of the most iconic logos in the corporate world.
Sure.
We had the Nipper Dog with RCA, and we had Mickey Mouse with the Walt Disney Company. We had just broken Kenny Chesney over at RCA B&A Records, and we were having great success, a renaissance of John Anderson, Lori Morgan, and we had broken through with a group called Lone Star. Mm-hmm. We were having a lot of great success, but for whatever reason, Joe did not renew my contract. So I was out of work for about 7 days. I was so blessed because got a call from Randy Goodman, who was the head of the Disney label, Lyric Street. I had worked with him previously at RCA, and Randy called and said, "Hey, when can you start?"
Wow.
And I said, "Well, you've already hired your promotion team." He goes, "Well, it's okay. I'll create a spot. You tell me what you want to be called, and I'll bring you on board." So what a blessing that was. At that point in my career, I still thought I had some juice left.
Yeah.
I still had a standing in the community of Music Row. So, yeah, I went and interviewed with Virgin Records and DreamWorks and CBS, and they all expressed interest. But then I just thought the Disney thing was the right move. I came on board as like vice president of special projects, which then developed into marketing. We had a great run at Lyric Street. The biggest act we had, obviously, was Rascal Flatts. Mm-hmm. But we had some platinum success with Shadazy. We brought Aaron Tippin back. He had a down period, and we brought him back with a few hits. So, and then we started signing a bunch of American Idol finalists, like Josh Grayson, Bucky Covington. To this day, my biggest disappointment was Sonia Isaacs of the Isaacs family. I thought she was destined to the Hall of Fame. But for whatever reason, we couldn't get her on the radio. I guess she was destined to be a gospel and a bluegrass act, But yeah, what a run we had at Lyric Street.
During that time, when you start seeing things trend in a certain direction, as far as artist development, maybe there's not so much artist development anymore. Maybe it's, this particular artist has gone viral. Maybe they've won one of those shows or whatever. Probably for a radio guy like you, for a record promotions guy like you, might have been a red flag or two in your mind as far as, I'm not sure this is the right direction, but it's a new direction, maybe not the right direction.
Yeah, it was a tough time. Plus, we were not selling records the traditional way. We were losing all the record stores. The streaming world began, and that's about the time that I got a little burned out on record promotion. Spotify and Pandora and all those streaming services have they've become the new chart, the new music discovery. Mm-hmm. So radio has kind of taken a back seat to that process. But yeah, in 2010, for whatever reason, Disney decided to close down Lyric Street. They didn't want to be in the country music business anymore. They paid out my contract. And you know what? It was kind of a blessing because I was really getting toasty, or fried to a crisp in record promotion, dealing with the change of the landscape. It wasn't just going into a radio station and being friends and forming a relationship with one guy. Now, one guy in Atlanta was making choices for 100 stations.
Yeah, your big groups. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, iHeart, Cumulus, CBS, which became Odyssey. It just changed, and I was ready. I was ready to semi-retire. So, I thanked everybody at Disney for, 12 good years. Came home, talked to Patty, and said, let's readjust our budget. Mm-hmm. And if we can do this so I can bridge my way to retirement, because I think I was at 2010, I was 60 years old. So I thought, maybe I should go back to radio.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, in 2009, I tried to buy WDKN in Dickson. Mm-hmm. In 2009, me and another Disney guy, we both had, a desire to do that. I went out to Dickson and met one of the three owners that was trying to sell the station, looked at the property, went out to the transmitter and asked them for their financials over the last year or so. Me and my buddy were going to buy the station, and that's how I was going to end my career as the owner and operator of WDKN. I got outbid by a guy by the name of Kenneth Forte and his lovely wife, Lori. They bought the station. A couple of months later, I went out to Dickson to meet Kenneth. I was curious. I wonder who was it that bought the station that I was also bidding on. And I met Kenneth, and lo and behold, he's like, Dale Turner. He says, I used to listen to you at Kissin' in Little Rock, because that's where he's from. Mm-hmm. And I guess he, listened to the station and knew of my name anyway. So anyway, he said, why don't you come over and do my morning show? That was a blast. I had an absolute blast. At that point, I knew I had some pensions coming in retirement. Mm-hmm. So I went over and did the morning show, and it was just the best time I ever had as a DJ. Kenneth didn't handcuff me with a format. He was like, Dale, just play songs of the artist that you worked with.
Do your thing.
And tell your stories about, working with Alabama and Clint Black and Rascal Flatts. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And it was such fun. And so I did that from about 2011 to 2017 when I officially retired.
Let's talk about our dear friend, the late Chuck Doffin. Did your paths ever cross before your time in Dickson, as far as did you ever have any interaction with him when you were in record promotions and he was on air in Dickson County? Where did that connection begin?
I did not really know Chuck through my RCA years. He was asking for service. He needed, record service of all the latest product. But at that point, I was the head of promotion, so I delegated all that stuff down the pipeline. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really have any interaction with Chuck. But when I did finally meet him through Brother Donnie Craig,
that's right,
I just fell in love with the guy. What a beautiful person. And he had such a loyalty and love for Dickson, Tennessee, and for WDKN. Mm-hmm. And I always admired that. So we became fast friends. Loved his country music. He knew it inside and out. Mm-hmm. What a pleasure it was to have him in my life in the last few years.
And you clicked instantly with Donnie Craig as well. Great on-air chemistry.
Yes. We had a blast. And, he and I co-hosted the Friendly Neighbor Time, which was on WDKN every morning, 6:30 to 7. Donnie and I are the same age, so we had the same kind of, memories from high school. And, although I didn't go into the Army, he did, and he shared so many wonderful moments, and he loves his Lord. He's a great pastor. We just clicked. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how it sounded on the air. My wife used to, listen to us, and she'd laugh and have smiles on her face all the time about, whatever, topics we were coming up with. So, yeah, Brother Donnie.
It was never, ever boring. That's for sure.
No.
With you two involved. You talked about 2017. You decide, okay, I'm going to put the brakes on everything, slow down. But you decide to write an autobiography. Talk about that process.
Yeah, Ken, I actually started it probably early 2012, 2013, because I was only doing the morning show at DKN, mm-hmm. and so it was really a part-time job. And so I had some time on my hands, and I told my wife I wanted to leave something behind for our grandchildren. We have two grandchildren, two boys. Just something for them to read maybe later when they're interested to know what their grandpa did, because he did some crazy things. He had quite a journey. So I started writing, and what I used as reference were all my scrapbooks. I got a bunch of scrapbooks that I kept all these years, from radio station to radio station, record company to record company, artist, that I've had the pleasure of dealing with. And so I use that for talking points to kind of stir my memory and tell the stories.
Turner's Big Radio and Record Adventure. It is available at Amazon.com. Once again, available at Amazon.com. I understand some royalties from those sales are donated to St. Jude. That's a cause very near and dear to your heart, isn't it?
Yeah. Patty and I always supported St. Jude, not only when we lived and worked in Memphis, but, in the record business, Randy Owen of Alabama became a big supporter of St. Jude. And I went over there and toured the hospital several times, and it melts your heart to know the good work they do with children that shouldn't have to suffer like they do. Exactly. So yeah, we always, and so when I wrote my book, I decided any royalties I get, I'm going to just donate to the hospital. So that's been a blessing.
It's been about a decade almost since that was published. So
true.
Things have happened in the past decade. Understand there's a bit of an update, bit of a tweak underway for that book that's coming down the pike.
Yeah, Ken, I'm going to revise the last half of the book and try and consolidate some of those crazy stories, because a book shouldn't be that long, shouldn't be that many pages. I mean, it shouldn't be War and Peace. So I'm going to consolidate that and then add on from 2017 on and talk about some of the beautiful discoveries Patty and I made. We traveled until she got ill. So there's some stories there. My grandsons have grown up, and one of them's in college right now playing football. There's things to be said and some final thoughts, as I age out that I want to share.
Dale Turner, a longtime radio personality, a true legend in the radio business, the music industry, record promotions business as well. Looking back, if you had to do anything over again, change the script, if you will, anything pop into your mind, or do you think things worked out just about how they should?
Professionally, I don't think I would change anything. I had this grand notion that I might get inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame. But you know what? I didn't stay at one place long enough to really establish, the credentials that it takes, like Jerry House stayed at WSIX for almost an entire career. I jumped around because I was trying to reach that next ladder of success. So yeah, I think I just have to appreciate, the moments that I had with people like Les Akery and Jonathan Frick and Dan Daly. Personally, the one thing I would have done differently was I married my high school sweetheart, and I was so one-dimensional in my marriage. I focused so much on my radio career, and I forgot to pay attention to what was going on at home, So if I could change anything in my life, it would have been that. Mm-hmm. But then I think, on the other hand, if I would have had a successful first marriage, then I never would have met Patty, and she's been my absolute life partner. Otherwise, I don't regret moving halfway down from St. Louis to San Antonio and then way back up to Indiana, and then, I'm back and forth from Tennessee to Cincinnati.
Life advice from a life well lived. What comes to mind when you think of someone just starting out, maybe just graduated, whatever, best life advice that Dale Turner could dispense?
Well, somebody told me one time, embrace change or die. So, yeah, it's like I've seen so many configurations of music over my career, vinyl, cassette, CD, digital. And so that's kind of an analogy that I use, don't fight technology, and, change when you can, adapt. Mm-hmm. And I would always visualize my next goal in my mind. If I could visualize, and that can also be applied to, doing promotion, visualize how you're going to do the presentation to convince or persuade this client to give you some airplay and to put your song on his playlist versus the competition's. Mm-hmm. Then I also read a very important book early on in my career called Dress for Success. You should always dress for the position that's above you. I think that serves you well, because you do have to conduct yourself visually sometimes. And then I always assessed my goals every 3 to 5 years. Maybe that's why I bounced around so much in the business. I saw where I thought I needed to be. Like when I was in Nashville, I had a goal that said work at a top 30 market by the time I'm 30. And I achieved that because I got to Cincinnati.
Uh-huh.
And always return your phone calls and be kind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was voted most friendly in my high school. And somebody asked me, how do you suppose you won that award? And I'm like, because I was friendly to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just be kind, be friendly. I mean, it doesn't cost any extra energy.
Exactly.
So there you have it.
Great advice from a life well lived, the life of Dale Turner. Thank you so much for being such a good friend. I was introduced to you through Chuck, through Brother Donnie. I cherish our friendship.
Yes,
I appreciate you so very much. You've opened up your home to record this in today. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing these amazing stories from quite the career. Dale Turner, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate you.
Dale Turner, our very special guest on Home Folks Dickson County Visit 3. Quick reminder, if you like what you hear, there's more on the way. Please subscribe here at the YouTube channel. It's free of charge to do so. That way you'll be in the know, up to date as far as what visits are coming down the pike next. Next time you're on Facebook, be sure and follow the page there. Home Folks Dickson County, Home Folks Dickson County on Facebook. Until our next visit, take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us.